You can hear me okay? Wonderful. Well, welcome all, and thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar on the nuclear dimensions of the war in Ukraine. Understanding that the human costs of war already are devastating and a humanitarian disaster is unfolding for the people of Ukraine, we acknowledge the additional threat of nuclear war hangs heavy over this conflict, and that's the aspect that we're going to be covering in our webinar today. This event is hosted by the Physicist Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. The coalition was founded in 2019 with a grant from the American Physical Society's Innovation Fund. And we've been operating with the support of APS and the Carnegie Corporation to reach out to physicists to educate them on nuclear weapons issues and mobilize those interested in opportunities for nuclear threat reduction. We feel strongly that a new generation of the physics community must become informed, engaged, and active as knowledgeable advocates on nuclear issues. Besides events like today's webinar, we help members advocate for sensible nuclear policies directly with policymakers. We give physics colloquia on nuclear issues, more than 100 so far at physics departments and national laboratories. Please let us know if you'd like your institution to host one. And we offer fellowships to help train the next generation of citizen scientists. For those of you joining us this afternoon who aren't members, we invite you to join the coalition. And Mark Alcesser will put a link in the chat that will allow you to do that. Today, we plan for this event to go until 2 p.m. Eastern, and we will post a recording on of the panel to the coalition website afterwards if you can't stay for the whole thing. I am very pleased to have such a knowledgeable and insightful group of panelists today. Presenting and taking your questions, we will have Pavel Podvig, Alex Glaser, and Daryl Kimball. Pavel is a senior researcher in the Weapons of Mass Destruction program at the United Nations Institute for Defense, UNIDIR, Defense Research, his Disarmament Research. His current research focuses on nuclear disarmament, arms control, and nuclear security. Pavel started his work at the Center for Arms Control Studies at the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. He's also a researcher with the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton and a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. He runs his own research project, which I'm sure many of you know, called Russian Nuclear Forces. And in recognition of his work in Russia, the American Physical Society awarded Pavel the Leo Szilard Lectureship Award in 2008, along with Anatoly Dyatlov. Pavel's areas of expertise include nuclear disarmament, arms control, fissile materials, verification, and nuclear security. And Pavel will be presenting first. I'll introduce all of the speakers. After him will be Alex Glaser, who's an associate professor in the School of Public and International Affairs and in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Princeton University. Alex has been co-directing the program on science and global security since 2016. Along with Harold Fivesen, Zia Meehan, and Frank von Hippel, he's a co-author of Unmaking the Bomb, which I commend to you all to read, a book from MIT Press. For Princeton's work on the Nuclear Warhead Verification Project, Foreign Policy Magazine selected Alex as one of the 100 leading global thinkers of 2014. And the third speaker we have today is Daryl Kimball. Daryl has been the executive director of the Arms Control Association and a publisher and contributor for the organization's monthly journal, Arms Control Today, which I hope you all read, since September 2001. For more than 2 decades at Arms Control Association, Daryl has led the organization's education, research, and policy advocacy campaigns on a range of issues, including the cancellation of new nuclear weapons programs and the negotiation, ratification, and entry into force of nuclear arms treaties. Daryl writes and speaks extensively, I'm sure you've seen him, about nuclear arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation, and other pertinent topics. In 2011, the MacArthur Foundation recognized Arms Control Association as an exceptional organization that effectively addresses pressing national and international challenges with an impact that is disproportionate to its small size. So pleased to have all of this expertise here. We're going to get started. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, not the chat. You'll have the ability to upvote questions that you'd really most like to see answered. If you put questions in the chat, we may not see them. And I am going to get us started right away with Pavel Podvig. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Laura, and thanks APS and the coalition for inviting me to speak. It is quite unsettling, I would say, that there is a nuclear dimension to the Ukraine, to the crisis, to this war. And in fact, the nuclear weapons were kind of introduced in a very visible way from the very beginning, when the Russian president announcing the start of this special military operation, start of this invasion, warned those who would interfere from the outside that Russia's response would be swift, and that the consequences would be such as you've never seen in your history, which was, I think, meant to be understood as a nuclear threat. And we also know a few days later, as if to make sure that the kind of message got through, the president ordered what was called the special mode of combat duty for Russian strategic nuclear forces. That was clearly meant to be a signal, political signal, most of all, that nobody should try to interfere with the with the crisis, and nobody should try to attack Russia or threaten to attack it. The question, of course, is does this all mean that Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons, and what the kind of options and what the options are there? It appears that not really. If we are talking about the kind of this special mode of combat duty and levels of alert, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the fairly large fraction of the Russian strategic forces, Russian nuclear forces, is already on fairly high alert. If you try to estimate, it's about 1,200 warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are either in silos or on mobile launchers. They could be launched promptly. And also there are submarine-launched ballistic missiles on submarines that are on patrol. It appears that though there were no steps that would bring that force into a higher level of alert, because there are ways of doing so. For example, one would expect submarines to leave the port, go to sea, or mobile missiles kind of dispersing in the forest somewhere. That has not been done as far as we can tell. So, but still, there is a significant force that is ready to go, and that's just the reality how these nuclear forces operate. The slightly, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a good news, but the reality is that other than warheads on those ICBMs and SLBMs, the rest of the nuclear weapons appear to be they are not deployed, which means that they are not attached to their delivery systems. For example, if we're talking about weapons that could be delivered by air, there are no aircraft sitting on tarmac with nuclear bombs in the bay or nuclear cruise missiles, or there are no Iskander missiles, the short-range ballistic or cruise missiles that are kind of driving around with nuclear warheads on. Those weapons are believed to be in storage sites located at least a few kilometers from delivery systems. So, and they could be deployed, of course. There is a procedure for that, of course, but that would take a number of steps. They would have to be taken out of the bunker, loaded on trucks, driven to the airfield or to their missiles, and then mated there, assembled if necessary, and then loaded. So again, as far as we can tell, none of that has been done. This would be a fairly visible process that would take a certain number of steps and time, and that would have been detected. Although there are probably ways to do it covertly, but it's still something that is hard to hide completely. So the question there is, it appears that, again, whatever steps were taken, certainly there are, so far at least, there are no signs that Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons in this war. When we talk about the kind of potential options here, I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is that there is absolutely no plausible military mission for those weapons in this conflict or in other conflicts as well, but especially in this conflict. And and people often ask what about strategic, tactical, what the yield, low yield, can you use low yield weapon, or is it more usable? I think one, again, important point is that any use of nuclear weapons would be strategic. So in a sense of the strategy is the way to resolve the conflict in a decisive manner, the entire thing. So that would be that would have to be a strategic use, even if it is only a single weapon detonated, for example, as a demonstration. And a demonstration, it is important to also remember that a demonstration of what? And as I said, I mean, there is no military mission for these weapons, and they are the only plausible use for them is basically to target cities, target civilians, and basically to kill a lot of people, to put it bluntly. And even if it's a demonstration strike, then it would be a demonstration of a determination, of a resolve to escalate further and to end up kind of killing a lot of people. So that is important to again keep in mind when you think about sort of what kind of how we should think about this potential use, and that's the only way to think about it as basically humanitarian or inhumane and I would say criminal use. So does it if we kind of a step keeping that in mind, what are the possibilities here? And I think I would say that it is highly unlikely, and it's very difficult, if possible, to imagine that Russia would decide to use nuclear weapons sort of out of the blue. Sort of, and again, you may have seen the kind of speculations that facing this or that, the setbacks in the military operations, so Russia could use again to do what first, and then the question is sort of to what purpose, and why would that be in any way helpful to achieve any of the goals. And it is also important to keep in mind that but there are nevertheless there are kind of pathways to the escalation. Even if it's not going to be kind of out of the blue, there are ways that things could reach a point where that step could be conceivable, at least in the eyes of the kind of Russian military and the Russian leadership. Russia, strictly speaking, the Russian military doctrine allows, or in the doctrine, Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in certain circumstances, of course, in case it is attacked by nuclear weapons, but also in the case when it is a conventional, when the state is under conventional attack, that puts the very existence of the state in danger. So that's the official kind of formula, which is reasonably close to most other nuclear doctrines. The problem, of course, is that this formula leaves, I would say, uncomfortably plenty of room for interpretation. What is the existence of state? What is Russia, attack on Russia? Does it include an attack on Russian forces? What is the state? Are we talking about the existence of the state or the existence of the country? And state could be understood as the current state with the current leadership and all that. So, but still, I think if we try to kind of think about it in some way, I think it is the pathway, the possible pathway to an escalation is probably would have to involve some direct conflict, direct military contact between the Russian forces and the forces of the United States or NATO. And probably would involve some attack against the territory of Russia. And again, you could think of ways to get there, and which means that everybody should be careful about various steps that people are taking, because because we don't know where the red lines are, and nobody knows. And I think even the Russian leadership in the Kremlin, they also don't really know. It may depend on very kind of circumstances of the moment. Yeah, my take, the final kind of a point would be that when one way of kind of thinking about it is to keep it very kind of clear and simple that any use of nuclear weapons would be, as I said, inhumane and unacceptable, and should be criminal. And even the idea of bringing nuclear weapons into this conflict should be condemned in very kind of clear and unequivocal terms. So let me stop here. I guess we'll have some Q&A later. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much, Pavel. Yeah, we'll have a lot of questions and discussion, but I think we'll move on to our second speaker, Alex Glaser. Thanks so much.
Hello, can you hear me? And can you see the slides?
Yep, both.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Laura, for the introduction. earlier on. In my remarks, I would like to walk you through a short simulation that we made a few years ago. It's a video available on YouTube, and you're welcome, of course, to watch it, even though I would recommend doing this perhaps after the talk. I only have a few screenshots from the video in the next couple of minutes. And as you can see, it's called Plan A, How a Nuclear War Could Unfold. Let me just briefly summarize who was involved in this effort. While I uploaded the video to YouTube, where it currently stands at roughly 3 million views or so. We produced this as part of a small team here at Princeton, primarily involving Alex Glaser, Tamara Patton, Moritz Kütt, and myself. Plan A was originally produced as part of a small exhibition here at Princeton University that opened in November 2017, so actually quite a few years ago. And I made it public on YouTube sometime in 2019. So often I get now comments on YouTube, obviously, who thought or believe that we sort of made this just now as part of this current crisis. And as you may imagine, it's quite popular, unfortunately, right now. Perhaps a quick note on how we put this together. Very briefly, our team, we sat down actually mostly with Bruce Blair, who unfortunately passed away far too soon in 2020. We sat down with Bruce Blair over several afternoons, and we sort of developed the scenario together, primarily based on his advice. We defined sort of different phases of this conflict. That is how a conventional war could become nuclear, with perhaps 2 or 4 nuclear weapons being used, all the way to an all-out global thermonuclear war. We discussed how many weapons would be involved in each phase, identified the launch sites and possible targets in all these cases. And even though I should say we spent several days typing in GPS coordinates into various spreadsheets, obviously this was not a multi-year research project based on archival research and so on. Obviously, it was all unclassified what we did, and obviously also was not meant to be a sort of prediction or a forecast. Obviously, this is the worst case scenario that hopefully was then and still is today highly unlikely, but we try to understand, or we try to visualize how you could get from a conventional war all the way to a global catastrophic crisis, because I do think there's sort of this disconnect where someone might imagine, well, yes, one nuclear weapon could be used, but sort of the scenario that you see here illustrated on the screen is sort of so unthinkable that it's hard to connect the dots, so to speak. So in a nutshell, we start with what we call nuclear warning shots. The simulation begins in the context of a conventional conflict. And of course, this is very much why I think Plan A is unfortunately relevant today. Specifically, we had assumed that Russia might attempt a fait accompli takeover of one of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. This is following sort of the Crimea crisis from 2014. And NATO, compelled by Article 5, would intervene, and NATO forces advance to retake the states, and they would advance presumably through Poland. And in this situation, Russia would launch a nuclear warning shot, and Pavel Podvig just talked about this, and I'm sure we talked more about this in the Q&A, from, in this case, from a base in Kaliningrad against the advancing NATO forces. Second assumption we made here was that NATO retaliates with a single tactical nuclear airstrike, in this case, I believe, coming from Germany. And again, I believe we can talk at length in the Q&A how likely is it that NATO would respond to such a first use from the Russian side, let's say, again, with a nuclear weapon. I think there's arguments on both sides why this may or may not happen. As you know, Pavel also mentioned, and I do want to emphasize this, militarily, of course, neither of these events, a nuclear weapon used by either Russia or the US, would be really relevant or needed. It's clearly has a very different would have a very different reason. Okay, then we move to what we call, the tactical nuclear war in Europe. For Plan A, we assume that the conflict would deepen after first use of nuclear weapons in Europe, because clearly the use of 2 to 4 tactical nuclear weapons would not change the conventional balance on the battlefield at all. I mean, everything would be sort of very much unchanged afterwards. And so in our scenario, the fighting would escalate to a tactical nuclear war in Europe. Here we assume that, and again, this is primarily based on Bruce Blair's sort of input, would send 300 warheads via aircraft and short-range missiles to hit NATO targets and troops in Western Europe. These are the NATO nuclear weapon bases in Germany, Italy, Turkey, the Netherlands, Belgium, and the UK. NATO conventional bases, ships, and as I mentioned, conventional troops. NATO would respond with approximately 180 nuclear warheads that would all be delivered via aircraft and target roughly 100 sites in Russia, including the tactical bases, central storage sites, conventional bases, fighting positions, and radar sites. And we estimated using Alex Wallerstein's nuke map, and I'm sure many of you may have seen this website, a total of about 2.6 million fatalities over several hours, which is which is a very low number, and we only considered immediate fatalities and not anything caused by fallout and the complete collapse of the public health system. And then finally, we sort of went to step 3 or phase 2 here in our scenario, the counterforce plan, with Europe destroyed, and essentially once nuclear ammunition in the tactical exchange is exhausted, we considered the possibility that NATO would launch a limited strategic nuclear strike of about 600 warheads from US land and submarine-based missiles, and they would aim at Russian nuclear forces and control centers. And as things, the sort of conventional wisdom goes, Russia would then respond before losing its weapon systems, launch on warning, and respond with missile launches from its silos, the road mobile vehicles, and the submarines. Again, 3.5 million death over about 45 minutes, a number that is far too low by any meaningful sort of estimate, but we report only the immediate fatalities here. In the Plan A video, we also include a final phase during which the most populated cities and economic centers in the US and Russia would be targeted. Again, here the aim would be to inhibit the other side's recovery, and 5 to 10 warheads would be aimed at each city, and this part of the plan would cause most of the immediate human suffering and death, roughly on the order of 100 million people. But I do want to emphasize that even a counterforce attack, of course, would have catastrophic consequences on human life. Here's one example where a counterforce attack on an ICBM silo field that is about 150 miles away from Moscow, Kozelsk, would likely, depending on weather conditions, but the wind primarily blows toward Moscow. The fallout from such an attack would cause several million deaths in the region through acute radiation syndrome alone, fallout following the attack, not including sort of long-term cancer incidents. And that is something, of course, we would have to keep in mind here. And as always, I do want to highlight here that words fail to describe the human suffering really that is involved in any nuclear weapon use, especially in urban areas. And we always have to keep that in mind and acknowledge that when we discuss the scenarios that I've shown you in the last couple of minutes. Final slide here for me. So how likely is it that a major strategic nuclear exchange between Russia and the US sort of follows from the crisis that we're currently facing? I mean, of course, it's small. It's hopefully very, very small, but I would argue it's not zero. Importantly, I do think we tend to underestimate the risks of escalation that even a single nuclear weapon use could entail. Now, you don't have to take my word for it, and instead see what General John Hyten has said. He was commander of US Strategic Command from 2016 to 2018, and US Stratcom every year plays a war game, Global Thunder, and in a speech I think that he gave in 2018, he mentions to the audience, how do you think this exercise ends? How do you think it ends? It ends the same way every time. It does. It ends bad, and the bad meaning it ends with global nuclear war. And with that, I hand it over to Daryl, I guess.
Thank you, Alex, very much for painting sort of the worst case scenario here of where this conflict would go. Before we move on to Daryl, there was a clarification question I just wanted to point back to you before we move on. Essentially, Leo Bellantoni was asking about the models underlying the simulation. What were the assumptions you made? And I guess I'd add my own question. Do these reactions trace what you know about US and Russian war plans? Are these a realistic implementation of what you know about how nuclear weapons might be used in a conflict?
I hope I understand the question correctly, and I can go into more detail, perhaps also offline later on. But I mean, as I said in the beginning, we sat down with primarily with Bruce Blair, where we sort of, once we had divided the scenario into 4 different phases, or let's say the tactical nuclear war in Europe, the counterforce plan and the counter-value plan, if you will. We looked at the numbers, or Bruce sort of suggests the numbers of those weapons that would be fired, plus what they would be, where they would be going, and very ballpark. Let's say 2 warheads per silo, or 5 to 10 weapons per city, depending on population. And these were sort of our simple rules. But as I said, nothing that we used was sort of at a classified or detailed level, and we didn't really meant to attract that much attention that this YouTube video is attracting now. It was really meant as part of an exhibition to visualize a number of other infographics and data that we had available for that occasion.
Thanks, really appreciate it. We'll also put a link in the chat to a previous webinar the coalition hosted on the effects of nuclear weapons that goes into some of these details that Alex was talking about in more detail. And so thanks. Next, please, we have Daryl Kimball.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, Alex and Pavel. Thanks for the invitation to speak to you all and discuss these issues. I mean, as we just heard from Alex, I mean, Russia's war in Ukraine and the nuclear saber rattling from President Putin is a sobering reminder of the risks that we have been living under and continue to live under from nuclear weapons and the deterrence policies that the United States and Russia both continue to perpetuate. Nuclear threats and alerts are not uncommon. Were not uncommon during the Cold War era. They were no less dangerous then than they are now. But one thing that I think we need to note is that since the Cold War has ended, we have not seen such nuclear chest beating in the middle of a hot war in Europe. So we are in an unprecedented situation, at least one in which we've not been in for decades. And the reason why, in my view, such rhetoric and raising of nuclear alert levels, even if, as Pavel said, there haven't been significant changes in Russia's nuclear operations, is that they can conceivably lead to misinterpretation that leads the other side to take their own nuclear counter moves that can lead to escalation and potentially a nuclear attack. I think one thing we need to also acknowledge and recognize is that so far the Biden administration has wisely not matched Putin's nuclear taunts. The United States even postponed a scheduled Minuteman III ICBM launch about a week into the Russian invasion, so as not to send the wrong signal. But the risk of escalation is real. And Alex was talking about this, and you could see this in the Plan A simulation. Right now, U.S. and NATO warships and warplanes are engaged in a scheduled exercise in northern Norway. The sea lanes in the Black Sea are busy. The airspace over Ukraine is highly contested. So there is the potential for a military encounter that leads to a shoot down deliberately or accidentally. That could lead to escalation. And certainly if NATO decided to try to impose even a limited no-fly zone over certain areas over Ukraine, that would most certainly lead to a direct conflict between NATO and Russian forces. And because US and Russian military strategies reserve the option to use nuclear weapons first against non-nuclear threats, fighting between Russia and NATO could quickly go nuclear. So, as Pavel noted, Russia's doctrine states formally that nuclear weapons can be used in response to an attack with weapons of mass destruction, or if a conventional war threatens the very existence of the state. These conditions don't exist right now, but if there is in the next few weeks or even months a direct exchange, or if Russia believes a serious attack against Russia is underway, President Putin might consider or threaten to use tactical nuclear weapons to tip somehow the military balance in favor of Russia. So I think that is a low risk, but as Alex said, as Pavel said, low risk is not no risk. And so we are living in a heightened state of nuclear danger right now, higher than it was at least just a few weeks ago. Now, the United States also has a nuclear policy that is not too dissimilar from Russia's. It is the United States, like Russia, also believes that nuclear weapons can be used as a shield for conventional military operations. I mean, that is what Russia is essentially doing. They're using a form of nuclear blackmail to try to keep NATO and the United States out of the conflict in Ukraine. And I've heard this directly from senior Russian officials just in the last couple of weeks, that the purpose of these nuclear comments by President Putin and other senior Russian officials is to ward off a direct US or NATO military intervention in Ukraine. Now, like Russia's formal nuclear policy, Joe Biden's policy, which is about to be announced, the nuclear posture review has just been completed. They're just beginning to roll this out this week. Reports indicate, and I think they're accurate, that the review will state that the fundamental role of the U.S. arsenal will be to deter nuclear attacks against the U.S. or our allies, but it will still leave open the option, as we have for decades, the option to use nuclear weapons first in extreme circumstances, including to counter conventional biological, chemical, or possibly cyber attacks. So these policies, the United States and Russia have these nuclear deterrence policies, have and can and will continue, as long as they exist, perpetuate the tendency for both sides to maintain forward deployed nuclear forces, tactical nuclear weapons, and possibly intermediate range systems in Europe and elsewhere. And as we also need to understand, once nuclear weapons are used between nuclear armed states, even if in a so-called limited way, there's absolutely no guarantee it will not lead to the kind of all-out exchange that Alex was describing in the Plan A simulation. So a few observations about what all this means and how we should interpret this, what lessons we might draw, and then I'm going to offer some thoughts about what might be done in the short and medium term to address and reduce the nuclear risk. So, as I said, the risk of nuclear war right now may still be low, but it's not zero. We're in a heightened state of risk of nuclear weapons use between the world's two largest nuclear weapons possessor states. In contrast to the acute nuclear risks that we saw or might remember from the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which just lasted 13 or so days, the current situation may last much longer, 13 weeks, maybe even longer, depending on whether and how and where the conflict goes, which no one really knows about. Second, Putin's invasion is also a reminder that, contrary to myth, nuclear weapons do not prevent major wars. Rather, they can facilitate aggression by nuclear armed states that make wars waged by nuclear armed states far more dangerous. And I think also we need to recognize, and as we look ahead, that in the wake of the conflict in Ukraine, we can expect that many in the security establishments of the United States, Europe, and Russia will argue for new nuclear weapons capabilities to counter one another. And perhaps even for the first time in decades, argue for an increase in the total number of US and Russian deployed nuclear weapons. And that's especially a danger because the last remaining treaty that limits the US and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals New START is due to expire on February 5, 2026, and the prospects for new agreements has gone appreciably down just in the last month. So, what can be done? Let me just point out a couple of things that I think need to be stated. It's not really the focus of this webinar, but in the near term, in order to reduce the risk of a nuclear conflict emerging from this very brutal war, the war must end and it must not expand. NATO and Russia in particular must avoid direct conflict in the coming weeks and months. And as we've seen, there are some who would argue for a more direct US or NATO involvement by setting up a no-fly zone. And as we've heard President Putin say, Russia considers certain kinds of weapons deliveries by NATO forces to Ukraine to be an act of aggression. So, we are in a very uncertain time here with respect to this conflict, so long as it goes on. The other thing that will be important to reduce the risk of inadvertent direct US, NATO, and Russian conflict is to maintain effective lines of communication between the militaries, so as to avoid the kinds of miscalculations that can lead to this sort of escalation. Unfortunately, the communications channels that do exist are not being effectively utilized. And there are mixed reports about to what extent senior US and Russian commanders have been speaking with one another. So those are some of the things in the near term that have to be done in order to avoid a wider escalation. Beyond that, there are some things that we all need to be thinking about, I believe, to reduce the risk again of nuclear war and to reduce the risk of dangerous arms racing. And I think we do need to look at this and consider this to be a major crossroads in the long struggle against the bomb. We do need to be thinking in some new ways, and certainly we need to be moving away from reverting to the destabilizing Cold War behaviors and deterrence concepts that got us into the current situation. So a few ideas here that I think are worth consideration that require further discussion for those of us who are concerned about these issues and who want to see progress rather than regression. So changes to nuclear doctrine is certainly one thing that we need to be looking at. Adoption of policies prohibiting the first use of nuclear weapons would certainly increase stability and reduce the risks of nuclear war under certain circumstances. Biden, unfortunately, has missed his opportunity to make such an adjustment. And as a result, until the next nuclear posture review is done, probably by another president, the chance to make that kind of adjustment is quite some time away. But we have to recognize that even if the United States and Russia and China were all to subscribe to no first use doctrines, that would still not eliminate the dangers that nuclear deterrence strategies and arsenals create, because that they all depend upon maintaining a credible threat of prompt retaliation in response to a nuclear attack. And that also brings up the issue of changes in another part of US and Russian doctrine that would be helpful, which would be to move away from their current launch under attack postures that give each president just a few minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike, mainly involving land-based ICBMs, if there is a credible warning and an actual attack by one side or the other against the other. So that is an issue that I think we need to revisit, especially keeping in mind that Joe Biden may not be the president forever, and another person might be running for re-election. And we all know here that already that President Putin is a risk taker. So let me talk about another option, which has been very much on the minds of many people, especially as this crisis in Ukraine has erupted, which is the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is a very strong statement from the 120 plus non-nuclear weapon states that negotiated it about the illegality of nuclear weapons and the threat of use of nuclear weapons. It does, in my view, deserve support, and it bolsters the taboo against nuclear weapons use. But it, in my view, does not provide a meaningful formula in the short and medium term to walk the nuclear weapon states back from the nuclear brink and prevent a new round of dangerous arms racing. So it's time for some other things to try to mitigate the risks that may be ahead and to get us back on the track to saner policies. And the first opportunity that is going to come up, it may not be the best chance, but it is the next chance, is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which is coming up in August. And this is going to be the next major opportunity to have a global debate about the experience, the nuclear dimensions of the Ukraine war. If we can get that far without further nuclear threats and incidents. And what is, I think, going to be necessary, even more necessary than before, is for responsible nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states to come together on a meaningful plan of action on disarmament at the conference. And they need to do this, in my view, even though a consensus final document, which is the official objective of every one of these once every 5-year conferences, is not really within reach due to differences between the US and Russia, NATO countries and Russia. But what is possible is that a supermajority of states can speak up clearly and forcefully and outline the path forward. And we also need to recognize that even though Putin's war in Ukraine has derailed the US-Russian strategic stability talks that were underway last fall, that might have been a prelude for new agreements between the US and Russia on reducing their strategic arsenals, reaching arrangements on short and intermediate range weapon systems. The United States and Russia, the other nuclear armed states that are members of the NPT, are still bound by their disarmament obligations under Article 6 of the treaty. So in the absence of leadership from the US and Russia, which I think we cannot expect here, other responsible NPT states parties, particularly the so-called Stepping Stones group, Germany, Kazakhstan, Sweden, and others, as well as states in the non-aligned movement and those in the ban treaty movement, have a crucial role to play. They can, I think, and should step up and come together around a package that calls for the conclusion of further agreements between the US and Russia to reduce their arsenals before New START expires, to call for a moratorium on the introduction of intermediate range nuclear weapons in or within range of Europe. I call for all states to forswear the introduction of new nuclear armed cruise and hypersonic missiles, to recognize that any use of nuclear weapons would produce catastrophic humanitarian consequences, and that a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, nor should any state threaten the use of nuclear weapons. Also, given what Russia has done to the political guarantees that were given to Ukraine when it abandoned nuclear weapons in 1994, the NPT states parties should call for an immediate commencement of negotiations to develop legally binding security guarantees against unprovoked attacks from nuclear weapon states against non-nuclear weapon states. So that's a long agenda, but that's food for thought that I think becomes more important now, so that states can respond to the reminders that we've had about the nuclear risks through the course of the Ukraine war, and to move us away from the brink. The other thing we need to be considering is the fact that NATO will soon meet to approve an updated strategic concept. We can expect to hear that the war in Ukraine we can expect that the war in Ukraine will lead to conventional military buildups in Europe and perhaps also in Russia. There may be talk about new offensive missile capabilities on both sides. Russia has and Belarus have sent signals that if things don't go in the direction they would like to see, that Belarus may host some Russian tactical nuclear weapons, which would certainly be highly destabilizing. So we need to work to oppose these kinds of destabilizing offensive, particularly nuclear weapons buildups in Europe and elsewhere. And finally, and not unimportantly, even though the US-Russian nuclear dialogue has been derailed and Russia's credibility as a negotiating partner has been severely damaged in the past couple of months. It's going to be important for the United States and Russia to resume their strategic stability dialogue at some point. And we have to remember that even during the darkest moments in the Cold War, in the aftermath, for instance, of Russia's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the US and Russia did see it to be in their interest to exercise restraint, to respect treaties like the SALT II Treaty in 1982, and they should continue to do so in the future now, even if New START expires. And they need to, it's in their interest to use arms control to manage the risks of their strategic competition. So when this is going to happen, I do not know. It is too hard to predict at the moment. But it's also important for all of us to be reminding our governments that that is also part of the long-term solution to reducing the long-term nuclear threat. So let me stop there. We've put a lot on the table for everyone to consider. And Laura, good luck managing the questions, which I'm sure are voluminous at this stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Daryl. That was wonderful and comprehensive and illuminated past guardrails that kept us away from the horrors of nuclear war. And you outlined some really good practical steps that we might be helping to pursue so that this again doesn't get out of control, and reminding us that the 5 nuclear weapon states of the NPT just in January all reaffirmed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. So we would hold them to that. So we have, as you said, many questions. I'm going to try to group them together thematically so we can get to as many as we can. So the first set is for you, Pavel. There's some basic questions just about how Russian nuclear command and control works. Does the Russian president have sole authority to order a nuclear attack in theory and in practice? I think would be helpful to understand both of those, and to just give us an idea of, again, I think there's a lot of different signaling coming out, and where is the ultimate decision making resting in Russia at this point?
Well, these are good questions, and I think the honest answer is that we don't really know. Again, the doctrine says that the decision to use nuclear weapons is the decision that can only be made by the president, but we don't know if someone else has a right of veto, if you will. My understanding is that the command and control system that was built back in the Soviet days definitely did not leave the sole authority in the hands of one person. how it works exactly, it appears that in a case of an attack on the Soviet Union and now Russia, there is a way for the commander-in-chief to communicate with the military command, presumably with the Minister of Defense and probably with the Chief of the General Staff, and they would discuss this and make a decision. It's a bit more, the process is a bit different from the one in the United States, in the sense that it does provide certain safeguards that take off the pressure to make the decision right away. And for example, by all indications, the system was built to make sure that the order to launch the missiles based on the signal of an attack can only be issued when the system detects actual attack, which means actual nuclear detonations on the territory of Russia. So that's in the circumstances when Russia is under attack. I think it is reasonable to assume that if we are talking about a premeditated attack, the first strike, whether it involves a small number of weapons or a large number of weapons, most of these safeguards could be circumvented. After all, the commander-in-chief is the commander-in-chief, and the people the military are supposed to follow the orders, and that could be done. However, it does appear that there is a certain it's a process, so it's not easy. It's not like there is a button that the president could press and everything would go. No, the orders would have to be issued. People would have to follow the orders, go through certain procedures to make sure that everything is done. I would assume that in that process provides in itself provides a certain safeguard against the kind of a rash decision of a single individual. So that would be that's my understanding. Again, we need to keep in mind that again, the president is the commander-in-chief, and eventually all these could fail, but it's still there are certain safeguards there.
Great, thank you. This is a question directed mostly at Alex, but I'd be interested in hearing other perspectives as well, and group some of these together. Stephen asks, given the horror laid out by your presentation, Alex, would everyone agree that should Russia go nuclear in Ukraine, that the West should not respond with their own nuclear strike, but should respond in a conventional way? So that talks about off-ramps in your simulation. And there's questions also, I think, more about on-ramps. Is it plausible that not just the US or NATO would go nuclear, but that another actor in Europe might go first, such as UK or France, and how does that affect the way you're thinking about the simulation? So Alex, would you want to take a first crack at that?
Sure, at least perhaps on the very first part, and I saw this a few times in the chat. I mean, the only data point I have is, and of course we also discussed this at the time, when there's the first warning shot, could there be a conventional response? And sort of it makes, from a military perspective, certainly would make sense. The one data point I have, and it's in Fred Kaplan's book, The Bomb, where he discusses a war game that was played a couple of years ago in the National Security Council, which resembles very much the scenario that we are looking at right now. There was sort of this escalate to de-escalate situation. That's the way it was termed there. And it was played by the civilians or the deputies at the time. And someone had the idea, well, we're actually not going to respond with a nuclear weapon. We're going to respond conventionally, which is just as good from a military sort of perspective. And wouldn't it be, to our advantage to really demonstrate that, in this case, Putin is really the outcast and we have the moral high ground, we keep it conventional. And that's how the game ended when the deputies played it. It was then played again by the principals and the generals. And sort of in a nutshell, it ended after 2 moves with a global, thermonuclear war. And the decision was made, you have to respond with a nuclear weapon in kind to even such a, whatever you want to call a demonstration, warning shot by the other side. And the main reason was to demonstrate, and this is Ash Carter being quoted, demonstrate America's will and ability to uphold the alliance and retaliate in kind. So it was all about NATO resolve, and it was clear this is not about military purpose. It didn't matter. It was all about the symbol, the symbolism of responding to a nuclear attack. Again, this is what should give us pause, because I think for many of us, certainly for me, it does make sense to respond conventionally. But we know that this is not how many of our sort of elected government officials think about this issue. Daryl, yeah.
No, that's a very good, I think, explanation of why there's no guarantee that there wouldn't be retaliation and it wouldn't escalate. So very good explanation. But I think as we talk about the nuclear dimension of the war in Ukraine, I mean, we need to distinguish between a couple of things. There is the possibility of a conflict involving NATO and Russian forces, and that is what the Plan A scenario was taking a look at, and that's what Alex was just talking about. And then there's the question that's come up as of late, would Putin use tactical nuclear weapons in his attack on Ukraine? I do not see any conceivable reason, purpose, rationale for doing so. I think the possibility is even lower, because in that case, he would be inviting NATO and US intervention, which is clearly what he doesn't want to see. And he would become an international pariah, even to a greater extent. But how would NATO or the United States respond if he did? That we also don't know. That apparently is what is being discussed, was discussed last week. Certainly, it should not involve the use of nuclear weapons by NATO or the United States. So anyway, these are 2 separate issues. And Pavel, you may have some more to add to this conversation.
Go ahead, Pavel.
Yeah, I just posted a link to Fred Kaplan's story that Alex mentioned. I would encourage you to read it. On this kind of a potential response, I think, again, as I said, in my view, the only reason nuclear weapons could be used in this kind of a conflict would be to send a signal that the side that uses nuclear weapons is prepared to essentially kill a lot of people. That's just put it bluntly. So when you look at it this way, responding in kind, responding by or threatening to respond in kind is actually telling that we are also prepared to kill a lot of people. And that's basically, that should end the conversation here, I think. And I think that's a useful, in my view, way to frame the issue. Thanks.
Thank you. This next one is posed to Daryl, but I'd also, again, be happy to have all of you weigh in on this. Of course, we are not there yet. We're still in the middle of it, but looking at it at a sort of more long view, what are the consequences of this of the Ukraine war for nuclear nonproliferation are, do we anticipate that states are going to reassess the utility of nuclear weapons, take the message that Ukraine would have been safe had it found some way to retain their nuclear weapons? I think there's a lot of misconceptions about how easy that might have been for Ukraine to do, but the hypothetical is, does this increase the state's perceived value of nuclear weapons?
No, it's an excellent question. I think first of all, Russia's attack on Ukraine in 2014 in Crimea, and now certainly has created a lot of unease in non-nuclear weapon states about security guarantees extended by nuclear armed states. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a senior diplomat from a non-nuclear weapon state. That was her main reaction to this in terms of how this is going to affect the non-proliferation world. The Budapest Memorandum, just very briefly, it was an arrangement by which Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan all forfeited the nuclear weapons that they'd inherited from the Soviet era. They did not have control of those weapons. They could not have maintained those weapons. They were offered political security guarantees by the United States, the UK, and Russia that were political in nature, clearly not strong enough. It would not have been possible, I think, for Ukraine to continue to exist as an independent state if it decided in 1994 to try to retain nuclear weapons. We would have had probably a conflict in the 1990s rather than in 2022 like this. I don't think that this is going to lead states that have already made the choice not to pursue nuclear weapons to pursue them, but it may send messages to some countries like North Korea. It might reinforce their belief that they need nuclear weapons to deter an attack from the United States or South Korea. It may change calculations in the long term in Iran down the road if they actually get to the point where they're actually trying to decide whether they want to have nuclear weapons or not. It is created damage to the non-proliferation system. The other damage, as I was alluding to, is the fact that the process for reducing the number and the role of nuclear weapons has been severely damaged. We've lost time. Russia is using nuclear weapons right now, the threat of nuclear weapons, that is, in order to shield its forces from intervention by NATO and the United States. So this has created a lot of damage. It's hard to see exactly how we're going to recover, but it will take time, and we need to get back on track. But last thing I would say is that how much damage this creates depends on how the governments around the world respond to this, and what they do and what they say in the weeks and months ahead. And that depends in part on what we do as citizens to urge them to do the right thing.
Thank you, Daryl. Alex or Pavel, do you want to answer this question?
If I may, just very briefly, I think it's, in my view, there are different conclusions that could be drawn from this conflict about the utility of nuclear weapons. And I certainly hope that the idea that nuclear weapons kind of protect you would not be the one, because it is not. They are not. If you look at what is happening, what we see actually is that nuclear weapons are being used actively to shield the aggression. And that's just the fact, and in that sense, the nuclear deterrence works well for Russia. If you look at the other side, that you also see that nuclear weapons don't offer much of a protection to those who are supposed to be protected. I've been having a lot of conversations with the journalists and people in places like Poland or Estonia or Lithuania, they don't feel particularly safe because they have this umbrella over them. No, this umbrella is not strong at all. And you can see that NATO is now talking about moving for conventional forces to Eastern Europe and all that. So nuclear weapons don't really protect you to the extent that people believe that may. And in the end, we are in the middle of a situation where we actually, even if the probability of this possibility of this kind of a nuclear exchange is very remote, I mean, the numbers are pretty scary. So I think this is really the time when we should kind of actively question the assumptions behind this idea that, oh, nuclear weapons kind of keep us warm in the winter. They don't, and they actually, there is a huge cost and there are no benefits. Thanks.
Well, it is to be hoped that that would be the conclusion. While not completely nuclear weapons related here, there is a question that I think would be helpful for people to hear an answer to is, and there's a lot of concern around safeguards on Ukraine's nuclear power plants. There are, I believe, 4 nuclear power plants with 15 reactors. And what is a challenge that the IAEA can keep those under safeguard and that we can keep those nuclear power plants working safely during this conflict. Pavel, since you're on the fissile materials panel.
Well, we can only hope that everybody understands the dangers of these objects and these facilities, and I believe that both sides know that these nuclear power plants should be treated carefully, but things could go sideways and not necessarily the people on the ground who are fighting around those facilities, they don't necessarily have the same degree of caution. So it is dangerous. I don't think that it's the kind of the IAEA safeguards issue. It is a safety issue, and it also that was a good question. We should keep that in mind, and these are additional dangers.
Great. So there's some questions kind of wanting to dig a little more deeply into. This is an idea that you brought up, Daryl, about the kinds of security guarantees you might provide to non-nuclear weapon states that would convince them in a robust way that it was not to their advantage to seek nuclear weapons. And so this was asked specifically around Ukraine, but I think as a more general proposition, how do we think about that? And maybe more specifically, what could the United States do to encourage that?
Well, it's a good question that I think we need to explore more deeply. I think we need to remember that the non-nuclear weapon states have been pushing for legally binding negative security guarantees for quite some time. This was a key part of the 1995 bargain that led to the indefinite extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The idea has been kind of cast to the side for the last 35 years. The United States has issued political statements assuring that it will not attack non-nuclear weapon states that are in good standing with their NPT obligations, which excludes a couple of key countries like North Korea and Iran. In this case, Ukraine was clearly meeting its NPT obligations, its safeguards obligations, contrary to Putin's crazy suggestions that Ukraine was capable of, or perhaps pursuing a nuclear weapons program. So I think, one of the things that we need to start with is to put this issue back on the agenda. Even a legally binding agreement between nuclear armed states and non-nuclear weapon states does not guarantee that assurance will not be broken. I think it can be helpful. And then I think we need to think about, okay, what additional penalties can be levied against states that threaten to use, let alone use, nuclear weapons in the future? What steps could be taken to further penalize them? What can be done to strip them of their veto powers at the UN Security Council, for instance? How that is done, that's a complicated diplomatic challenge. But these are the kinds of questions that I think we now need to be thinking about much more seriously. It's an area of, I think, non-proliferation policy that has been too long ignored.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. You've reminded me this question has been upvoted a number of times. So the question is our assumption that we are dealing with a rational actor still valid, or to what extent does it have to be modified under such a strongly centralized leadership style as in Russia? Pavel, my guess is that will be to you.
You mean the, sorry, could you?
Are we still dealing with a rational actor? That's essentially the question. I think it's really specifically speaking in a rational way. I guess, do we have incentives that we can provide?
I guess a month ago, or a little bit over a month ago, I would say yes, but the kind of the actions are irrational. But I worry because if you look at this whole war, there is no rational idea behind it, and that's the you could still hope that basically the prospect of a nuclear war would be a powerful deterrent, but in the end, I don't know. It's not a very strong deterrent. We had to kind of recalibrate our assumptions about rationality in a very serious way when this invasion started.
Just real quick, Laura, I mean, like I'm not a psychologist. No one has examined Vladimir Putin lately. I think, his actions appear to be rational in the sense that he's got reasons for them. He's not lost his mind from a psychological standpoint, it looks like, but what he's doing is clearly mad. It is wrong. It is highly risky. But all that said, I mean, the real problem here, I think, is that the power, decision-making power to order the launch of nuclear weapons, whether the United States or Russia or India or Pakistan, wherever, is highly centralized, and that is extremely undemocratic. And it needs to be changed. And I think this situation is a reminder of that problem. We may have one, more reasonable person in office at one point, but we might not have another leader later on who's as reasonable and rational. So, we need to think about ways in which that decision-making power is at least has greater checks and balances. I mean, there's been a debate about that in the United States through the Trump years. I think this should be something that we're all thinking about, especially in those countries that possess nuclear weapons.
Thanks, Daryl, good point. Yeah, and we're seeing maybe a high tolerance for risk taking, whether or not you call that rational or not. I think there's certainly seen an elevated taste for that. So we have 5 minutes left, and what I'm going to do is just ask if you have any last parting wisdom, any recommendations, any couple of things that you think that the participants in this webinar might be able to do to weigh in primarily with the United States policymaking circles, but what we can do to make a positive effect. Let's start with you, Pavel. We'll go back in the same order. Sorry.
Well, I think there was a question in Q&A, sort of what could citizens do to kind of convey this message about the nuclear weapons being inhumane and unacceptable. What citizens can always do. I mean, they could. I mean, there is a political action in various forms. I mean, participation in this coalition is one of those, and I think that this is the way. One of the ways to do it. Daryl mentioned the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That is kind of exactly the idea of this inhumane nature of nuclear weapons, around which people kind of organize themselves. That is something to look at, to be aware of, and I would suggest support. So yeah, but again, the political process. I mean, as I'm as a Russian citizen, I can see what happens when a country kind of lets the political system to deteriorate to the point where there are no effective checks and balances. And as a long-time observer of the United States, I do worry about the political processes in the United States, as I think many of you do. And that's this is this eventually it is these things are political, and there is no other way around that.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Pavel just said. I mean, right now, I hope we all agree a priority number 1, 2, and 3 has to be to stop the killing in Ukraine. That is what's on the agenda right now. But I do, see, of course, that in the coming years, I mean, the world will be different once we somehow resolve the current crisis. And there will be really 2 competing sort of narratives or debates. One, unfortunately, in my view, will be sort of increased defense or military spending that we're probably going to see across the board, including, I'm a citizen of Germany, and which has just pledged another $100 billion for increased defense spending, and it's led by parties with a strong pacifist history. So I think we're going to see that. This will be on the conventional side, and will be missile defense sort of options, that sort of thing. But on the more, I also think, I hope and I think there will be a more visible debate around how wrong the existence of nuclear weapons are. We already mentioned this earlier today. They are being used by weapon states all the time, even if they're not detonated. I think this trope that we tend to use, that nuclear weapons are useless, is, as someone else has said previously, is sort of wrong, and we have to sort of accept that and sort of work. Accept that fact and challenge the very existence. And again, I'm not the first one. I'm the last one here to mention the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which will have its first meeting of states parties later this summer in late June in Vienna. And I do think this is a big opportunity, not just for the folks who will be in Vienna, but worldwide, and even also in countries that are not party of the TPNW, to sort of regroup and see and exchange ideas and see what lessons did we really learn from this crisis, because I do think there will be very important lessons to be learned, even in the best case, which means we won't see a nuclear war, at least.
Thanks, Alex. And Daryl, you have just about a minute.
Okay, well, real quick, my more detailed thoughts about some of the next steps are in a Bulletin of Atomic Scientists article that came out about 10 days ago. That gets into some detail, but I would say, we need to, those of us concerned about the risks of nuclear escalation need to be in contact with our elected representatives, especially those of you with elected representatives. I live in the District of Columbia and I have no representative with voting powers. And I think it boils down to, about 3 or so key messages at this particular time. Number one, we need to end the conflict as soon as possible. We need to de-escalate and avoid scenarios that could get the US and Russia into direct military conflict. 2, more and new nuclear weapons are not going to make the United States or allies safer. And 3, we need to maintain and restore the arms control guardrails that can help manage the future nuclear competition and risks that lie ahead. And that is also going to require a lot of creative thinking from the likes of Laura and Alex and Pavel and many others of you out there about how we do that. So at the moment, that's my distillation of my thinking about some of the path ahead.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thanks all for those who joined us for the webinar. Thank you especially to our panelists for really extraordinary insight and thoughts. Thank you for taking the time. We'll remind you again, please join the coalition if you're so moved. We have lots more of these events. And again, thank you.